5. I'll be sitting here. I'll give you a 5 sign. When we wrap up and down to 1. All right. Welcome. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hopefully you all can hear me. So I'm going to use a PowerPoint and I like to move around a little bit. But I thank you, Professor Allen, for that introduction. And would like to say that I'm honored to be sharing the podium with Dr. Kelly and with one of my best graduate students, Derry Green. And also like to acknowledge my father who's here visiting from New York. What I'm going to talk about today, as indicated, the topic is reform, resistance, and risk, the 3 R's of public education in North Baton Rouge. And first I'm going to start off, thank you. I'll start off by telling you a little bit about how I got interested in this topic, because as Professor Allen mentioned, most of my research is on race and ethnicity. A lot of it focuses on asset inequality, black asset poverty. But I became very interested in education in Baton Rouge because I have a son who's now 15 and a son who just turned 5 in December. And when I was being recruited to come to LSU and I sat and met with many of the folks in sociology and the wonderful folks in AAAS, I asked, well, how are the schools? And almost everyone said that they're terrible, they're horrible. I heard these wonderful things about Baton Rouge and about LSU and the community, but the schools were horrible. So I had to really think about what position I'd be putting my kids in by coming to a place where people were saying that the school systems were horrible. But there was always a disclaimer. So folks also said, well, the schools are horrible, but if you know how to navigate them, then you can find some good options. So even with that disclaimer, I really still had no idea what I was going to encounter. So as a parent, I was concerned about public schools. As a member of the community, I was concerned about public schools. But of course, being a sociologist, I wanted to go beyond my own observations and my own experiences and to really study the issue of public education. And I found that I wasn't the only parent dealing with these issues in Baton Rouge or in Louisiana, but that there was a pattern occurring. And as I became more aware about these patterns, I became even more and more disturbed and very concerned about public education and felt called, if not compelled, to write on the topic. And so, for those of you that were at the session this morning, you know that Roland Mitchell, Dr. Roland Mitchell, was one of the speakers. He's also an affiliate of AAAS. And he, along with Dr. Kenneth Fashing Varner in education, are co-editing a series with Roland and Littlefield, and they're looking for a number of people to write books as part of their series on race and education. And so this topic that I'm going to talk about today is actually a portion of that book project that will be the first book published in their series. And as was mentioned, the name of the book is Big Box Schools and the Danger of Race Education and the Danger of the Walmartization of Public Schools. And so I'll tell you what I mean by that. And essentially in the book, what I do is I argue that American public schools are at a crossroad. And this is not the first time we've been at a crossroad, but what I argue is that there are essentially 2 paths that we can take. That there's one that appears to be less traveled, and that on that path you have individuals who are concerned about public education, who think that parents should have a larger voice, that student success should be important, and that communities need to be connected to the schools, and that they should be community controlled. And then you have another pathway that seems to be increasingly populated, especially with philanthropists, including Bill Gates and the Walton Family Foundation and others, where it seems to be more about profit. So you have a lot of people telling you wonderful things about what the new charter schools and gifted and talented programs and magnet programs will do, and less about the role of the community and the connectedness between the community and its members. And so I'm urging people to try to go down that first path where it's a community controlled, community has input, and that we're really focusing on pupils and not profits. And so I argue in the book that there's this proliferation of what I call pop-up schools. So how many of you are familiar with these pop-up books for children? Right, so these pop-up books for children, they look really fun, they look really inviting. fighting for students. But if you have a child like my son who's 5, they're going to tear up the book at some point and rip the various pieces, and so it ceases to be a pop-up book after a while. But again, it's aesthetically pleasing and it looks really nice, but it doesn't necessarily last very long. And so I argue that in Baton Rouge and in other places, there's a growth of pop-up schools where you see some schools that are deemed to be failing, whatever that means. Suddenly they disappear and then they reappear under the same name or perhaps under a different name, but with a different theme and maybe different leadership, but with the same problems that contributed to the school being deemed failing in the first place. And so some charter schools might fall into that in that category, not all, but some magnet schools might fall into that category. And I discussed how some of the principals and administrators are almost like used car salesmen. They're telling you, oh, this new school is going to be different. We have this, we have that. And they're promising you lots of things, but those things are not always manifested. And I also make the argument that there's this mythology of school choice, right? So the term choice sounds really good, right? Everyone wants to have the choice to do a lot of things. They want to be free to do things or have the freedom not to do things. And so I argue that, again, this is a myth in that you're not really giving parents a viable option, right? So, and on top of that, when you offer these charter schools and magnet programs, they can't serve all of the schools' kids, right? So it sounds good when you say, oh, we're going to give you a choice, because there are some people who are oftentimes white, oftentimes more affluent, who do have those options. They do have those choices, right? If the school where they live in is not, the designated school is not a high-performing school, they have the choice to put their kids into a private school, for example. They may have the choice to move out into a neighborhood where the schools are so-called better. And if you are an economically disadvantaged family or a family of color, your choices might be limited. So this idea of school choice, I argue, in many ways is a myth. And so I also make the argument in this book that what you have is the adaptation of a business model to education. So just like the literature that you might see on big box stores like Walmart and others, and see the impact that they have on the communities, which are not always positive. Yes, it's a wonderful thing when you're in a rural community and you don't have any stores and you don't have access to certain things, and then Walmart comes in, for example, and you're like, oh, this is great now, this is going to bring in jobs and people have access to greater resources. But there's also evidence of a downside of what happens when big box stores come in, right? You lose the mom and pop stores, for example. The quality of products is not as great. People are stuck in low-wage jobs and so forth. And when you lose those individuals who ran those mom and pop stores, you're also losing some of the leaders in the community. And so you also start to have an issue in terms of being able to fight when other groups come in or other institutions come in to your community. So there's oftentimes an absence or a gap or loss of leadership as well. And so, you know, this is not an uplifting book. Once you see this project, you might be quite depressed about what's happening in public schools in Baton Rouge and beyond. But I do include a chapter, which I'm going to focus on now, which talks about the ways in which different community-based organizations are resisting this trend towards focusing more on profits than on pupils. And so, I don't know if you all, I focused on North Baton Rouge, and we heard a lot about that in the earlier session for individuals talking about Scotlandville, for instance. Some of you may have seen this map. It's a map showing the racial composition of Baton Rouge, and it's part of a larger series focusing on segregation in America. And I don't even have to tell you which part is which. I'll just tell you that the green represents the black population, and the blue or gray, from your vantage point, represents the white population. Okay? So you can draw your own conclusions about the extent to which there is literally a racial divide in the city of Baton Rouge. Again, green is representing black households, and the blue-gray is representing white households. And again, so I'm focusing on North Baton Rouge and an initiative in that particular area. The materials I'm showing you are from an initiative called Our Schools, Our Excellence. And Our Schools, Our Excellence is an initiative of Metamorphosis, a nonprofit organization, which I'll talk more about. But they provide this data at some of their community meetings so the what's going on in the schools in North Baton Rouge. And it's noted that 21 out of the 32 North Baton Rouge schools received a D or F performance rating in 2013. So this gives you some sense of the crisis in public education in North Baton Rouge. And this particular portion of Baton Rouge, as we saw from the previous slide, is over 90% African American. And so what I argued in the book was that, or the forthcoming book, is that there are a number of factors based upon research that are really critical or key or need to be in place when you talk about educational reform. And for those that are on that second pathway, where you have a lot of those pop-up schools I described, that they're missing a lot of these key factors. And so among them include the fact that schools should be neighborhood-based, right? That it should exclude barriers to enrollment and retention. One of the things I mentioned at a community meeting not too long ago was many of the challenges that parents face who have children in these magnet schools, for example, where they have to maintain a certain GPA in order to be able to stay in the school. Just imagine you as a parent are telling your child, look, you're in a good school, this is a magnet program, you gotta keep your grades up, because if you don't, then you're gonna be sent to the designated school. So what are you saying about the designated school and the kids that are in that school? And you're vilifying all those kids, or the majority of those kids, as well as the teachers, and telling your son or daughter, well, you don't want to be like them, right? And then if that child is not successful in the magnet program, that's exactly where they're going. And then what's your motivation then? So creating these barriers to enrollment and retention can be problematic. Oftentimes, in the road that's increasingly being populated by people who are pushing these pop-up schools is a lack of respect for the contributions, rights, and benefits of veteran teachers. I also, again, I'm focusing on the Metamorphosis program, but there's also a number of groups across the country who focus on teachers. And the numbers are really striking if you look at them in terms of how the teaching profession as a whole has dropped off the radar screen when it comes to looking at it as a prestigious profession.